At 11:32 on the morning of December 20th, 1943, Charlie Brown gripped his controls. The sky over Bremen, Germany, was thick with the smoke of 250 heavy flak guns. At just 21 years old, Brown was facing his very first combat mission as a pilot. He watched the explosions erupt around his formation, realizing the war was now real. The German gunners below were not ordinary soldiers, but elite officer candidate trainees. They were the best marksmen the Luftwaffe had, and they had been waiting all morning. Brown's aircraft was a B-17, its flying fortress known by the name the Old Pub. It carried 10 brave men and 6,000 pounds of bombs, destined for a fighter factory. Intelligence officers had warned the crew they would face hundreds of German fighters. However, they failed to mention that Brown was assigned the most dangerous slot. The veterans called it Purple Heart Corner, located at the very edge of the box. In this spot, defensive fire could not overlap, making the bomber an easy target. New crews were often placed in this lethal position to test their grit and skill. Brown's crew was the newest of all, flying into a trap they didn't yet understand. Before they could release their bombs, a 20mm cannon shell exploded in the nose. The plexiglass shattered instantly, sending shards of glass flying through the cockpit. At an altitude of 27,000 feet, the temperature outside was 60 degrees below zero. The wind began to howl through the open nose of the aircraft at over 150 miles per hour. The number 2 engine took a direct hit and died, vibrating the wing violently. Number 4 began overspeeding, forcing Brown to throttle back to prevent a fire. The damaged bomber began to slow down as the rest of the formation pulled ahead. Within seconds, the Old Pub was isolated and struggling to maintain its altitude. German fighter pilots spotted the limping giant and prepared for a systematic kill. A swarm of 15 Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs descended like wolves on a deer. The brutal attack lasted for more than 10 harrowing minutes of constant fire. The number 3 engine took several hits and dropped to only half of its power. Hydraulic lines burst, and the electrical system failed, leaving the plane crippled. The tail section was being torn apart by the relentless 20mm cannon fire. Sergeant Hugh Eckenrode, the tail gunner, was struck by a cannon shell and killed. He died instantly at his post, never seeing the fighters that delivered the blow. Most of the other crew members were wounded by flying shrapnel and bullets. Brown himself felt the sting of a bullet fragment as it lodged in his right shoulder. The extreme cold had frozen the oil in the majority of the defensive machine guns. Of the 11 guns mounted on the B-17, only 3 remained in working order. The chaos intensified when the oxygen system was finally ruptured by the fire. At 5 miles up, the human brain cannot function without supplemental air. Brown felt his vision narrowing to a pinpoint as hypoxia began to take hold. His hands went numb on the control wheel, and he felt his consciousness slipping. Beside him, his co-pilot Spencer Luke had already collapsed and was unconscious. Brown's last thought was that his crew would die on their very first mission. The Old Pub began to fall out of the sky in a terrifying, uncontrolled dive. The bomber dropped from 27,000 feet as the airspeed climbed past 300 miles per hour. The airframe shook with such violence that the wings threatened to tear off. Death seemed certain for the 10 men trapped inside the screaming metal hull. Then, something happened that defied all logic and the laws of probability. At 1,000 feet above the ground, the thicker air provided enough oxygen to Brown. He regained consciousness and grabbed the controls with every ounce of strength. The B-17 leveled out just above the treetops of the northern German countryside. Brown looked around the shattered cockpit and saw blood and debris everywhere. His tail gunner was dead, and his aircraft was a flying wreck of twisted metal. In his struggle to pull up, he had flown directly over a German fighter airfield. On the ground, a pilot named Franz Stigler was refueling his Bf-109 fighter. Stigler was a veteran who had already shot down 2 American bombers that day. One more confirmed kill would earn him the Knight's Cross Germany's highest honor. He looked up and saw the American bomber limping across the sky at 100 feet. Stigler climbed into his cockpit, and his engine roared into life with a snarl. Within minutes, he was airborne and closing fast on the crippled American plane. He positioned his fighter directly behind the B-17's shredded tail section. His finger rested on the trigger of his machine guns and heavy 20mm cannons. One squeeze was all it would take to claim his medal and end their lives. But what Stigler saw through his gun sight would change his entire perspective. He looked at the tail gunner's compartment and saw it was completely destroyed. Through the massive holes, he saw the body of the young American slumped over. Frozen red icicles of blood hung from the shattered turret in the bitter air. Stigler pulled his fighter alongside the bomber to get a closer look at the damage. He saw wounded men through the torn fuselage trying to help one another. He saw a crewman with his face covered in blood and another with a torn leg. None of them were fighting back because none of them were able to fight. In that moment, Stigler remembered the words of his commander, Gustav Rodel. Rodel had told his pilots that a fighter's honor came from how he killed. If I ever hear of you shooting at a man in a parachute, I will shoot you myself. To Stigler, these defenseless Americans were no different than men in parachutes. Shooting them down would not be a victory for Germany or for his own honor. It would be a cold-blooded execution, and murder had no place in his code. Stigler felt the rosary beads in his pocket and remembered his mother's faith. He made the ultimate decision that he would not pull the trigger this day. Franz Stigler would not earn his Knight's Cross by killing these wounded men. However, he realized the bomber was heading deeper into German territory. If Brown continued this course, he would be shot down by flak or other fighters. Stigler had spared their lives, but he knew they were still far from safety. The German pilot pulled alongside the cockpit and looked at Charlie Brown. He could see the terror in the young American's eyes through the glass. Stigler pointed down toward the ground, gesturing for the pilot to land. He wanted them to surrender so that the wounded could receive medical care. Charlie Brown did not understand the gesture and thought he was being threatened. He shook his head, refusing to bring his aircraft down on enemy soil. Stigler then pointed north toward Sweden, which was a neutral territory nearby. He hoped they would fly there to be interned and saved from the North Sea. Brown still did not understand and kept the plane flying west toward England. They faced 250 miles of freezing water and a bomber that was falling apart. Stigler realized he had only one option left to ensure their survival. He made the most dangerous decision of his life to protect the enemy. Stigler maneuvered his fighter into a close formation on the B-17's wing. He flew so close that the two aircraft appeared as a single shape from below. He knew that German flak gunners would not fire on their own elite fighters. This was treason, and if caught, Stigler would face death by a firing squad. Inside the bomber, Brown was confused and ordered his turret gunner to aim. He told him to watch the German closely, but not to fire unless attacked. The two enemies flew side by side over German villages and military roads. Stigler stayed with them mile after mile, acting as a human shield of metal. They reached the coastline where the Atlantic wall defenses were waiting. Radar stations and anti-aircraft batteries tracked the two planes together. Because of Stigler's presence, the gunners assumed the aircraft were friendly. The gamble worked, and the coastal batteries remained silent as they passed. They crossed the beach and headed out over the gray, choppy North Sea. Stigler had escorted them through the most dangerous airspace in all of Europe. He had saved 9 lives, but his fuel was low and his engine was overheating. He could not follow them all the way to England without being captured. Stigler pulled his Messerschmitt alongside the cockpit one final time. Their eyes met through the glass. Two men from opposite sides of a war. Stigler raised his hand to his forehead and gave Brown a sharp salute. He then banked his plane to the left and disappeared into the clouds. Brown watched him go, still stunned by the mercy he had just witnessed. He didn't know the man's name or why he had chosen to let them live, but the ordeal was not over, as they were still far from the English coast. The bomber was failing, and the crew was suffering in the freezing cold. Charlie Brown flew into the gray void of the North Sea with gritted teeth. The water below was barely above freezing, promising death to any who fell. He was flying on only 1.5 engines, barely maintaining his speed. The airspeed indicator read 140 miles per hour, just above the point of stalling. Behind him in the fuselage, the crew was fighting a desperate battle to survive. Alex Yelisanko had taken shrapnel in his leg and was bleeding out slowly. The morphine syringes were frozen solid and useless against the agonizing pain. All the crew could do was apply pressure and pray for the coast to appear. Sam Blackford, the ball turret gunner, was losing all feeling in his feet. The heating wires in his suit had shorted out, and frostbite was taking hold. The radio operator, Richard Petchout, worked despite a shard of metal in his eye. He tapped out distress signals into the void, but no response ever came back. In the tail, the body of Hugh Eckenrode remained as a silent reminder of the cost. Brown calculated they had 2 hours of flight time left to reach the shore. His hands ached from the struggle to keep the heavy aircraft level and steady. 9 lives depended entirely on his ability to hold the plane together. Finally, the gray cliffs of the English coast appeared through the morning mist. Brown had never seen a more beautiful sight than those distant green fields. The bomber was too damaged to reach its home base, so he looked for a closer strip. He spotted RAF seething and lined up for a dangerous, desperate approach. The landing gear barely locked into place as the plane descended toward the runway. Brown brought the old pub down in a controlled crash that sent sparks flying. The aircraft skidded across the tarmac and finally groaned to a complete stop. Charlie Brown sat motionless, his hands still locked tightly on the controls. 8 men climbed out of the wreckage alive, but their plane was finished. The bomber would never fly again and was eventually sold for scrap metal. At the debriefing, Brown told the intelligence officers the entire story. He expected them to be amazed, but their reaction was cold and calculated. The officers ordered Brown never to speak of the German pilot again. The incident was classified to prevent any sympathy for the German enemy. Brown obeyed the order and kept the secret locked away for many decades. In Germany, Franz Stigler also kept his mouth shut to avoid execution. 2 men on opposite sides of the war carried the same secret in silence. Each wondered if the other had survived the violence that followed that day. They were haunted by that moment of humanity in the midst of total destruction. The secret remained hidden from the world for 46 long years. The war ended in May of 1945 and Charlie Brown returned to West Virginia. He finished college and eventually rejoined the Air Force to serve in intelligence. He retired as a lieutenant colonel and started a business in Miami, Florida. He lived a full life, but he never forgot the face of the pilot who spared him. Franz Stigler survived the war but lost his home and his beloved brother. In 1953, he emigrated to Canada to start over as a businessman in Vancouver. He was a successful man, yet he often thought about that B-17 in the sky, wondered if his act of mercy had actually resulted in the crew's survival. In 1986, Brown was invited to speak at the Gathering of Eagles event. He decided it was time to tell the story he had been told to keep quiet. He described the salute and the mercy of the anonymous German pilot. The audience of retired pilots listened in a state of stunned, respectful silence. After the speech, Brown realized he needed to find the man who saved him. He began a massive search through military archives in the US and Germany. He wrote letters to historians and veterans groups across the entire world. Every lead went cold, and his friends told him the pilot was likely dead. Brown refused to quit and wrote one final letter to a Luftwaffe newsletter. He described the date, the location, and the details of the encounter. The letter was published in 1990, and a few weeks later, a response arrived. The letter was from Canada and began with the words, "I was the one." Franz Stigler had recognized the story and finally broke his own silence. After 46 years, he learned that the American bomber had made it home. Brown read the letter with tears streaming down his face in pure relief. Every detail matched his memory, confirming this was the man from the sky. Brown called directory assistance and found a number for Stigler in Vancouver. He dialed the number with trembling hands, and an old man answered the phone. Brown identified himself, and after a long pause, Stigler began to cry. The two men talked for hours, bridging the gap of nearly half a century. They discovered they had been living as neighbors across the border for years. They agreed to meet in person that summer in a hotel lobby in Florida. Two former enemies were about to come face to face in a world at peace. The weight of their shared secret was finally about to be lifted forever. In 1990, Charlie Brown walked into the hotel lobby, his heart racing. Franz Stigler was waiting for him, his face lined with the wisdom of age. For a moment, neither man moved as they looked into each other's eyes. Then they walked toward each other and shared a powerful, weeping embrace. A friend recorded the reunion, showing two old men holding each other tightly. Stigler looked at Brown and felt the weight of 50 years leave his soul. He had wondered if his decision mattered, and now he had his answer. The pilot he had spared was standing right there, alive and well. Brown showed Stigler photographs of his children and his many grandchildren. He explained that all these people existed because of Stigler's mercy. Stigler had never received his Knight's Cross for his actions in the war, but looking at those photos, he realized he had received something better. A few months later, Stigler was invited to an American bomber crew reunion. The veterans of the 379th Bomb Group welcomed him as their guest of honor. Two surviving crew members from the old pub were there to meet him. Sam Blackford and Richard Petchout embraced the man who had saved them. They introduced Stigler to their families, who all wept with gratitude. 25 people were in that room who would never have been born. The reunion made Stigler an honorary member of the American Bomb Group. Former enemies had officially become brothers in a bond that couldn't be broken. The story began to spread to newspapers and television stations everywhere. Brown and Stigler were invited to speak at museums and civic organizations. They traveled together, telling their story to audiences who were moved to tears. They were a living symbol of the fact that compassion can survive even war. Stigler gave Brown a book about jets and wrote a moving inscription inside. He wrote that he had lost his only brother to the violence of the war. He said that Charlie Brown had become as precious to him as that brother. Signed it simply with the words, "Your brother, Franz." The two men talked on the phone every week and visited each other's homes. They went fishing and celebrated holidays as one big extended family. But Brown felt that one thing was still missing from their incredible story. His crew had never been officially recognized for their bravery that day. The mission had been classified for so long that their record was blank. Brown began writing letters to the Air Force to demand the medals they earned. He wanted the world to know what his men had endured and survived. The Air Force eventually opened an investigation into the 1943 files. In 2008, the investigation into the events of December 20th was completed. The findings confirmed every detail of the mission and the German pilot. The Air Force made a decision that surprised many military historians. Every surviving crew member of the old pub would receive the Silver Star. For those who had passed away, the medals were awarded posthumously. 9 silver stars for a single crew was a feat that was almost unprecedented. Charlie Brown himself was awarded the Air Force Cross for his heroism. It is the second highest award for valor a member of the Air Force can get. The men of the old pub became one of the most decorated crews in history. 65 years after the event, they finally received their due honor. The ceremony was a solemn event attended by many proud families. Brown was 85 years old, frail in body, but standing tall in his spirit. Franz Stigler stood right beside him during the ceremony, as he always did. Stigler had been awarded the Star of Peace by Europe years earlier. The award honored his exceptional humanity during the dark years of conflict. But Stigler always insisted he had only done what any honorable man would. He had refused to murder defenseless men, following a much higher code. The story of their bond reached millions of people across the globe. Journalists and filmmakers captured their journey for future generations. In 2012, Adam Makos published a best-selling book called A Higher Call. The book was praised for its research and its portrayal of the human heart. It captured the essential nature of the choices men make in times of war. In 2014, the band Sabaton released a song titled No Bullets Fly. The music reached a young audience who had never heard the story before. In 2019, Surviving B-17 was repainted to look like the old pub. It flew at air shows to keep the memory of the original crew alive. The legacy of that winter morning grew far beyond the two pilots themselves. It became a universal symbol of mercy and the power of individual choice. Stigler had given up a prestigious medal to save 9 American strangers. In return, he received a legacy that would outlive him by many decades. But by the year 2008, both men were starting to grow very old and tired. Stigler was 92, and Brown was 87, and they knew their time was short. Franz Stigler passed away on March 22, 2008, in his home in Vancouver. He died in the country that had given him a second chance at life. Charlie Brown received the news in Florida and was deeply devastated. The man who had become his brother was finally gone from the world. But Brown was at peace, knowing that Stigler died knowing the full truth. The act of mercy in 1943 had truly mattered to so many people. 8 months later, on November 24, 2008, Charlie Brown also passed away. The two men who met as enemies were finally reunited in the afterlife. They died in the same year, as if they couldn't be apart for very long. The legacy they left behind continues to inspire people every single day. The book A Higher Call remains in print, teaching new readers about honor. The song No Bullets Fly carries their names to new generations of fans. The restored The Old Pub still flies, a silver ghost in the summer sky. But the most powerful legacy of all is found in the living families. Hugh Eckenrode's family finally got the answers they had sought for years. His grandniece found a lithograph of the two planes to honor his memory. The descendants of the surviving crew members now number in the dozens. They are doctors, teachers, and artists who owe their lives to Franz Stigler. When Stigler met these families, he was overwhelmed by the sheer scale of it. He saw a wall of faces in a crowd of lives created by one single choice. It all happened because he remembered the moral lesson of Gustave Rodel. He refused to shoot men who had no way to fight back against him. Stigler's note to Brown remains one of the most touching tributes in history. He wrote that Brown was as precious to him as the brother he had lost. Their story is not a story about the violence or the politics of war. It is a story about what survives in the human soul when the war is over. It is a story about an honor that transcends borders and nationalities. It is a story about a single act of mercy that echoes across time. Two young men met in a frozen sky in 1943 with every reason to hate. One had the power to kill, and the other had no way to survive. In that moment, something happened that defied the orders of the day. Franz Stigler answered a higher call and chose the path of humanity. Charlie Brown spent the rest of his life being grateful for that choice. Their story reminds us that we always have a choice, even in the dark. If this story moved you, please hit that like button to help it grow. Every like tells the algorithm to share this message of honor with others. Please subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a story. We rescue forgotten memories from the archives every single day. We tell stories about real people who showed extraordinary heroism and mercy. Drop a comment right now and tell us where you are watching from today. Our community stretches from the United States to the heart of Germany. You are a vital part of keeping these historical memories alive for all. Tell us if someone in your own family served in the great conflicts of the past. We want to know you are here and that you value these stories of the soul. Thank you for watching and for honoring the memory of these two brave pilots. Charlie Brown and Franz Stigler deserve to be remembered by us all forever. The plexiglass nose of the old pub was the first thing to shatter that day. Turned the cockpit into a freezing wind tunnel of chaos and loud noise. But even as the physical structure of the plane failed, the spirit held. The men inside were terrified, but they stayed at their posts until the end. Franz Stigler's Bf-109 was a masterpiece of German engineering and speed. It was designed to destroy bombers just like the one Charlie Brown flew. Yet on that day, it served as a guardian angel for a wounded enemy. The fighter and the bomber flew as one in a brief moment of silent peace. The 250 flak guns of Bremen were designed to fill the sky with lethal lead. They did their job well, tearing the B-17 into a useless piece of junk. But they could not destroy the will of the pilot to bring his men home. And they could not stop the Mercy that was about to take flight. When Brown regained consciousness at 1,000 feet, he was fighting gravity. The weight of the plane felt like a mountain on his young, tired shoulders. He pulled back on the yoke until his muscles screamed in the thin air. The recovery was a miracle that stunned everyone who saw the plane later. Stigler's decision to fly formation was a masterclass in tactical deception. He used his own reputation and his aircraft's silhouette to protect the Amos. He risked a firing squad because he couldn't live with the alternative. He chose his conscience over his country's demands for total destruction. The North Sea is a graveyard for thousands of airmen from both sides of the war. Its waters are unforgiving, and its waves are a cold, final resting place. The old pub defied the sea that day, limping across the waves on hope. The crew's survival is a testament to the engineering of the Boeing B-17. The classification of the story by the Air Force was a product of its time. The leaders feared that mercy would weaken the resolve of the fighting men. But they were wrong, as mercy is often the ultimate form of true strength. The truth eventually came to light, as it always does, given enough time. The reunion in 1990 was the closing of a circle that began in 1943. Two men who had been defined by a few minutes in the sky found peace. They proved that forgiveness is possible even after decades of silence. They showed the world that enemies can truly become the closest of brothers. The children of the crew are the living proof of Franz Stigler's great heart. They walk the earth today because a man chose not to squeeze a trigger. As we look back at the history of World War II, this story stands out. It is a beacon of light in a conflict that was defined by deep darkness. Charlie Brown and Franz Stigler have flown their final mission together now. May their story of a higher call live on in our hearts forevermore.